March 1943. Admiral Dönitz sees victory within his grasp. His U-boat wolf packs are savaging Allied convoys, sending over 500,000 tons of shipping to the ocean floor in a single month. In London, the Admiralty watches the numbers with growing dread. The lifeline is fraying. Britain is weeks from being cut off. The invasion of Europe a distant dream. The clock is ticking not towards an attack, but towards surrender. The Allies don't know it yet, but their last desperate answer is already sailing into the storm. This storm had a name, the Battle of the Atlantic, and for 3 long years the Germans had been winning it. The weapon of their success was the Unterseeboot, the U-boat. Specifically the Type 7, a marvel of lethal engineering. It was not a behemoth. It was a predator, built for one purpose: to sever the artery of men and material that connected the New World to the Old. Admiral Karl Dönitz, a submariner himself from the First World War, had perfected the strategy. No longer would U-boats hunt alone. He organized them into Rudel, wolf packs. They would stalk the convoys, shadowing them, reporting their position, and then, under the cover of darkness, they would strike. A coordinated, overwhelming assault from multiple directions that turned the defensive screens of destroyers and corvettes into a chaotic scramble. The heart of this deadly hunting ground was a place known to Allied sailors only as the Black Pit. It was a vast, unforgiving stretch of the North Atlantic, a 1,000-mile-wide gap beyond the reach of land-based air cover from either Britain or North America. Here, there were no guardian angels in the sky. It was just the ships, the icy water, and the wolves circling below. For the men on the merchant ships, it was a waking nightmare. Every ping of the sonar, every shadow on the water could signal the arrival of a torpedo. Victory for the Allies wasn't about glorious battles. It was about survival, about simply getting one more convoy through. The planners in Washington and London, men like General Eisenhower, knew the stakes. Every tank, every bullet, every soldier needed for the eventual liberation of Europe had to cross this ocean. If the Atlantic lifeline was cut, the war was lost. By early 1943, the U-boats were sinking ships faster than the combined industrial might of the Allies could replace them. The existing system was failing. Something had to change, or the war would be over before the real fight for Europe could even begin. The answer came not from a naval strategist, but from an industrialist. Henry Kaiser was a man who built dams and bridges, a titan of American manufacturing who saw the Atlantic problem not as a tactical puzzle, but as an equation of production. The Germans had perfected a high-quality precision weapon. They couldn't build thousands of them. The Allies needed a counter, and Kaiser's philosophy was brutally simple. Quantity has a quality all its own. He proposed a solution that naval purists found horrifying: the escort carrier. They weren't born in the hallowed shipyards that produced battleships. They were forged in the fire of mass production, often built on the hulls of merchant tankers or cargo ships. At Kaiser's shipyard in Vancouver, Washington, they were built with an almost impossible speed. These weren't graceful ships of the line. They were small, slow, unarmored, and top-heavy. Their crews called them jeep carriers or baby flat tops. They carried a small air group, typically a dozen Grumman Wildcat fighters and a dozen Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. They were, in essence, a patch, a crude, factory-made solution to a complex military problem. They were designed to do one thing and one thing only: sail into the Black Pit and carry the air war to the U-boats. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would pit Germany's finest engineering and most experienced crews against America's industrial muscle and a handful of untested ships. Among the first of these new weapons platforms to enter the fray was the USS Bogue. Commissioned in late 1942, she was the lead vessel of her class, a floating testament to Kaiser's philosophy. Her captain, Giles Short, was not a fleet admiral destined for grand battles in the Pacific. He was a pragmatist, a commander tasked with a brutal, unglamorous job. His mission was not to sink enemy fleets, but to hunt an unseen foe in the world's most hostile waters. The Bogue and her sister ships like the Card, the Core, and the Santee were not meant to be solitary defenders. They were the heart of a new concept, the hunter-killer group. A small carrier, accompanied by a screen of destroyers and corvettes, detached from the main convoy with the sole purpose of actively seeking out and destroying U-boats. But a ship is only as good as its senses and its teeth. And in 1943, the Allies were about to unveil revolutionary upgrades to both. For years, the U-boat's greatest strength had been its ability to communicate, to coordinate the wolf pack. Dönitz could command his submarines from hundreds of miles away, gathering them for a kill. But this strength was about to become a catastrophic vulnerability. The new weapon was called High-Frequency Direction Finding, or HFDF, affectionately known to sailors as Huff-Duff. It was not radar. It did not send out a pulse. It was a sensitive, sophisticated listener. Every time a U-boat surfaced to transmit a message, even a short burst of code, the Huff-Duff sets on the escort ships could hear it. A series of antennas would rotate, instantly providing a bearing to the source of the transmission. With two or more ships taking a bearing, they could triangulate the U-boat's exact position. The wolves were now broadcasting their own location every time they spoke. The hunter had become the hunted. Once located, the destroyers had to close in for the kill. For years, this meant the depth charge. It was an explosive drum rolled off the stern, set to detonate at a certain depth, but it was a blunt instrument. The massive explosions would churn the water, blinding the ship's own sonar and often allowing a skilled U-boat commander to slip away in the chaos. The new solution was codenamed Hedgehog. It was a forward-throwing mortar that fired a pattern of 24 small, streamlined projectiles into the water ahead of the ship. Unlike depth charges, which worked on a timer, the Hedgehog's charges only exploded on contact with the solid object. The psychological effect was immense. For the U-boat crew, there was no longer a warning explosion. There was only silence. And then, if the Hedgehog found its mark, instant oblivion. For the escort crew, a miss meant nothing but quiet splashes, leaving their sonar clear to refine the target's position for another salvo. The probability of a kill with a single attack jumped from less than 10% with depth charges to over 25% with the Hedgehog. On paper, the system was perfect. The carrier's aircraft would provide long-range search and aerial attack capabilities. The escort ships, guided by Huff-Duff, would close in with the Hedgehog for the final kill. But theories conceived in the quiet rooms of the Admiralty were one thing. The reality of the North Atlantic in winter was another. The men flying the Avengers and Wildcats from the Bogue's tiny pitching flight deck were about to test this new doctrine in the crucible of combat, in the very heart of the Black Pit. Official doctrine was a cold comfort against the North Atlantic gales. For the pilots and deck crews of the USS Bogue, life was a relentless battle against the elements before the enemy was even sighted. Launching a heavily laden TBF Avenger from a flight deck that was barely 300 feet long, pitching and rolling in heavy seas, was an act of calculated insanity. Recovering one was a miracle. The planes were tied down against winds that could rip them from their moorings, and mechanics worked in freezing spray, their hands numb, to keep the engines running. This brutal environment bred a culture of intense pragmatism, rules written in the calm of a Washington, D.C. Office often didn't survive first contact with a 40-foot wave. This was especially true when it came to tactics. The book taught pilots to patrol at a medium altitude, giving them a wide field of view to spot a surfaced U-boat. Once found, they were to coordinate with surface ships. But the U-boat commanders were veterans. They had lookouts scanning the skies constantly. A speck in the distance was all the warning they needed. By the time an Avenger could descend from 5,000 feet, the submarine would be gone, leaving nothing but a swirl on the surface. The pilots of the Bogue and her sister ships knew this wasn't working. They began to experiment, to rewrite the rulebook mid-flight. They developed a terrifying new approach. Instead of patrolling high, they flew low, sometimes just 50 feet above the churning waves, using cloud cover and the ocean's own clutter to mask their approach. When a target was spotted, often by the new airborne radar sets being fitted to their planes, they didn't climb to begin a standard bombing run. They did the opposite. They would cut their engines back, letting the propeller windmill in the slipstream, and begin a shallow, silent glide. An Avenger, a 3-ton war machine, would become a whisper. For the crew on the U-boat's conning tower, the familiar drone of an aircraft engine was the only warning they had. Now, there was nothing. The first sound they would hear was the shriek of wind over the Avenger's wings in its final dive, seconds before depth charges or rockets bracketed their vessel. It was a deadly, unauthorized, and brilliantly effective tactic born from frontline experience. This spirit of innovation wasn't confined to the cockpit. In the hangar bay, the mechanics and technicians were performing their own brand of battlefield alchemy. They were told the Avenger had a specific combat radius, a set range. But the black pit was vast, and the pilots needed more time in the air, more ocean to search. So the mechanics got to work. They scrounged, welded, and jury-rigged extra fuel tanks, fitting them into bomb bays or any other available space, stretching the endurance of their aircraft far beyond factory specifications. They also looked at the plane's teeth. Aerial depth charges were still cumbersome and often inaccurate. The crews wanted something with more punch and a flatter trajectory. They began bolting improvised rocket rails to the wings of the Avengers. These weren't factory-approved kits. They were makeshift solutions hammered out thousands of miles from any formal engineering department. Yet they transformed the aircraft from a bomber into a true strike platform. A salvo of rockets could rip open a U-boat's pressure hull, making it impossible to dive. This fusion of official technology and unofficial ingenuity was creating a weapon system more potent than anyone had planned. The hunter-killer group was evolving. It was no longer just a collection of ships and planes. It was a living, learning organism, adapting with every patrol, preparing for the decisive test that everyone knew was coming. May 1943 was just days away. The first week of May, 1943 began like any other brutal month in the Atlantic. Dönitz unleashed his wolf packs with renewed ferocity, targeting convoys with chilling success. For the Allies, the losses were staggering, the situation growing more desperate by the hour. But this time, something was different. Sailing into the heart of the storm were the hunter-killer groups, led by carriers like the USS Bogue. They weren't just escorting, they were hunting. On the 10th of May, the pieces of the Allied puzzle began to snap together, and the character of the battle changed forever. The Bogue was patrolling a sector of the North Atlantic where intelligence suggested a heavy concentration of U-boats were gathering to intercept an eastbound convoy. Her escorting destroyers fanned out, their Huff-Duff receivers listening intently. It didn't take long. A faint, high-frequency whisper crackled through the ether, a U-boat commander reporting his position, unwittingly signing his own death warrant. Immediately, the bearings from multiple ships flashed to the Bogue's Combat Information Center. The cross on the map was precise. It was a long way off, too far for the destroyers to reach quickly. This was a job for air power. On the Bogue's flight deck, the controlled chaos began. An Avenger, its engine already warm, was armed and brought up on the elevator. The pilot, briefed on the target's last known position, took off into the gray sky, climbing not to altitude, but dropping low, disappearing into the sea-level haze. For the crew of the German submarine, U-boat 89, the day was routine. They had surfaced to recharge their batteries and ventilate the stale air, confident in the vast emptiness of the ocean. The lookouts scanned the horizon, but they were looking for ships, for the telltale smudge of smoke. They weren't looking 50 feet above the whitecaps. The Avenger pilot saw it first, the long, dark shape of the U-boat on the surface. He throttled back, beginning his silent, deadly glide. The German crew heard nothing until the last possible second. The roar of the engine at full power, the scream of the dive, it was the sound of doom. The depth charges dropped, landing in a perfect straddle. The explosions lifted the U-boat from the water, breaking its back. It was over in moments. This was not a lucky shot. Over the next 11 days, this scene would be repeated with horrifying frequency. The hunter-killer groups turned the Atlantic into a killing ground. A day after the sinking of U-89, another U-boat's transmission was intercepted. Again, an Avenger was launched. Again, the low-level surprise attack. Another kill. The wolf packs, designed to concentrate their force, were now finding that their numbers were a liability. Each submarine that transmitted a message became a beacon, drawing the hunters. Captain Giles Short on the Bogue and his counterparts on the other escort carriers orchestrated the battle with cold efficiency. They were no longer reacting to attacks on convoys. They were proactively eliminating the threat. They used their aircraft as long-range scouts, their destroyers as close-in assassins, and their intelligence as a scalpel. The improvised tactics were paying off spectacularly. Pilots who returned reported the shock and panic on the faces of the U-boat crews, men who had never before been threatened from the air in the mid-Atlantic. The extended-range fuel tanks allowed the Avengers to loiter for hours, waiting for a submarine to surface. The jury-rigged rockets proved devastatingly effective, crippling U-boats and preventing them from escaping into the depths. For Dönitz and his command, the reports coming back were confusing, then alarming, then catastrophic. Submarines were simply vanishing. Veteran commanders with dozens of successful patrols were failing to report in. The Black Pit, once their safest hunting ground, had become a death trap. The climax of this 11-day onslaught came in a series of brutal, running battles. It was no longer a hunt for individual submarines, but an all-out assault on the very structure of the wolf pack. As U-boats were picked off one by one, the survivors would transmit distress calls or attempt to warn their comrades, only for those very signals to be intercepted by the ever-listening ears of Huff-Duff. The destroyers, guided by the electronic breadcrumbs, would then race towards the new positions, their crews readying the Hedgehogs. For the German submariners, the psychological toll was immense. The deep ocean had been their sanctuary, a place where they were the apex predators. Now death could come from anywhere. It could come as a silent shadow from the clouds, or as a pattern of silent splashes from a pursuing destroyer. The element of surprise, for so long their greatest ally, had been turned completely against them. The story of U-Boat 569 exemplifies the futility of their situation. Stalking a convoy, its captain surfaced to transmit a sighting report. The message was intercepted by the escort screen of the USS Bogue. Before the U-boat could dive, an Avenger was already overhead, dropping a spread of depth charges that damaged its rudders and diving planes. Crippled and unable to escape into the depths, the submarine was now a sitting duck. The destroyer screen closed in, and the methodical work of destruction began. It was a pattern of coordinated violence, repeated across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The escort carriers served as the central nervous system of the operation. From their plotting rooms, commanders could visualize the entire battle space. They saw the convoy as a slow-moving herd, the U-boats as circling predators, and their own aircraft and destroyers as swift interceptors. They were playing a deadly game of chess on a board the size of a continent. And for the first time, they could see every move the enemy made. By the 21st of May, the numbers were beyond dispute. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tidal wave. In that 11-day period, the Allied hunter-killer groups had sunk a catastrophic number of U-boats. The loss rate was unsustainable. More importantly, they had broken the morale of the U-boat force. These weren't rookie crews being lost. They were the seasoned veterans, the aces of the deep, who had terrorized the Atlantic for years. Their expertise was irreplaceable. The German industrial machine could build new submarines, but it could not build experienced commanders and crews overnight. Dönitz's strategy relied on a core of skilled professionals who could lead the wolf packs and train the next generation. That core was now being systematically obliterated. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz faced an impossible choice. He could continue to press the attack and risk the complete annihilation of his submarine arm, or he could pull his forces back, conceding the most critical battlefield of the war. His finely crafted weapon of war, the Type 7 U-boat, was being defeated not by a superior battleship or grander fleet, but by a collection of cheap, mass-produced carriers, newfangled electronics, and unorthodox tactics employed by men who refused to fight by the book. The precision instrument was being shattered by the sledgehammer. On the 24th of May, 1943, the teletype machines in the U-boat command bunkers began to clatter. A message was sent to all submarines operating in the North Atlantic. The order was terse, shocking, and unambiguous. The order from Admiral Dönitz was a strategic thunderclap. All U-boats were to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes immediately. For the Allied sailors who had endured years of relentless attrition, it was an almost unbelievable moment of deliverance. The wolves were retreating. The period that would forever be known as Black May was over. In a single month, the Allies had lost ships, but the Germans had lost 41 submarines, a staggering percentage of their operational force. The hunter-killer groups, centered around escort carriers like the Bogue, the Card, and the Core, had achieved a victory more decisive than any single naval battle of the war. This was not just a temporary setback for the German war effort. It was a fundamental strategic defeat. The Battle of the Atlantic had been the one front where Germany had a real chance of winning the war on its own terms. By starving Britain into submission, they could have shattered the Allied coalition and made any invasion of mainland Europe impossible. Now that hope was extinguished. The transatlantic lifeline was secure. The flow of men and material from the United States to Britain would not only continue, but would grow into an unstoppable flood. The great buildup for Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, could now proceed with confidence. The strategic consequences were immense, but the victory was also a validation of a distinctly American philosophy of war. The Germans had invested in quality, in creating the perfect weapon, the U-boat. They built the best tanks, the best fighter planes, but they could never build enough of them. America, by contrast, had leaned into its industrial strength. Henry Kaiser's Jeep carriers were a prime example. They were disposable, expendable even. A naval connoisseur would scoff at their lack of armor and slow speed. But there were dozens of them. They were good enough to do the job, and they were available in overwhelming numbers. The same principle applied to the technology. Huff-Duff and the Hedgehog weren't silver bullets on their own. But when combined and deployed across a large number of platforms, they created a system that overwhelmed the enemy's tactics. The victory of May 1943 was not the victory of a single hero or a single wonder weapon. It was the victory of a system. It was the triumph of mass production, of pragmatic innovation, and of coordinated, networked warfare. The pilots who flew off those tiny decks, the mechanics who kept the planes flying with scavenged parts, the radio operators listening for a faint whisper in the static, the destroyer crews who sailed into harm's way, they were all cogs in a new and devastatingly effective machine. This machine had not just won a battle, it had changed the very calculus of the war at sea. The U-boat threat was not eliminated entirely. The Germans would adapt, introducing new technologies like the snorkel and acoustic homing torpedoes. The fighting in the Atlantic would continue until the very last day of the war, but the U-boats would never again pose a strategic threat to the Allied war effort. They had lost their primary hunting ground. Their era of dominance was over, broken in 11 bloody days. The great fleets of troop ships and supply vessels could now cross the ocean with a level of safety that would have been unimaginable just months before. The legacy of Black May echoed far beyond the cold waves of the Atlantic. It provided a blueprint for future anti-submarine warfare, one that integrated air power, surface assets, and intelligence in a seamless web. The humble escort carrier, once dismissed as a stopgap measure, had proven itself to be one of the most effective naval weapons of the Second World War. These ships would go on to serve with distinction in every theater, from the Arctic convoys to the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, their versatility and sheer numbers providing a crucial advantage the Axis could never match. For the men who fought in this campaign, the victory was etched in more personal terms. It was the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished, the relief of knowing that the convoys they protected had a fighting chance. It was the memory of a U-boat breaking the surface, forced up by depth charges, its crew surrendering as their vessel slid beneath the waves for the last time. It was the camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared danger, on a pitching flight deck in the middle of a gale, knowing that your life depended on the skill and courage of the man next to you. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of logistics, a grim accounting of tonnage sunk versus tonnage built. It lacked the famous names of land battles or the dramatic clashes of capital ships. But in the stark, brutal mathematics of total war, it was arguably the most important battle of them all. Without this victory, there would have been no D-Day, no advance across France, no final defeat of the Third Reich in the West. It was the foundational victory upon which all subsequent Allied success was built. And at its turning point, in those 11 critical days of May 1943, the outcome was decided not by superweapons or grand fleets, but by the relentless application of industrial power, by the ingenuity of men who bent the rules to win, and by a fleet of small, unassuming carriers that sailed into the heart of the storm and changed the course of history. The Black Pit had been conquered, the lifeline secured, and the path to victory was finally, truly open.